In January 1901, the state of Mississippi purchased 3,189 acres of land in Sunflower County. But this wasn't for a new town or a government building. This land, which had been a plantation, was about to become something else entirely. The state was building a prison. And they weren't building it for rehabilitation or reform or anything resembling modern corrections. They were rebuilding slavery. The name of this place was Parchman Farm. Officially, it was called the Mississippi State Penitentiary. But to the thousands of black men who would pass through its gates over the next 70 years, it had another name. They called it Hell. This is the story of how America's South found a loophole in the law that abolished slavery, and how one prison became the closest thing to a plantation that survived the Civil War. This is the story of how the state of Mississippi turned human suffering into massive profit, and how thousands of black lives were destroyed in cotton fields under armed guards. And this is a story that didn't end in the 1800s. It lasted well into the 1970s. Let's go back to where this all began. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the South faced a crisis. The 13th Amendment had just abolished slavery across the United States. For Mississippi, this was catastrophic. Approximately 70% of the state's wealth had been tied up in the value of enslaved people. Overnight, that wealth evaporated. The plantation owners who had built their fortunes on free labor suddenly had no one to work their fields. The cotton economy, which had made Mississippi one of the richest states before the war, was in ruins. But the 13th Amendment had a loophole, a very specific exception that white lawmakers in the South noticed immediately. The amendment said, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." Except as a punishment for crime. That's all they needed. Within months, Mississippi's legislature got to work. In late 1865, they passed a series of laws that would become known as the Black Codes. These weren't ordinary laws. They were designed with one purpose: to criminalize black life and create a new supply of forced labor. The Black Codes were brutal in their creativity. Mississippi led the way, and every other southern state copied their model. The codes required black people to carry written proof of employment at all times. If you were found without this paperwork, you could be arrested for vagrancy. If you quit a job before your contract ended, even with good cause, you'd forfeit all your wages and could be arrested and returned to your employer by force. If you couldn't pay the fine for vagrancy, which most couldn't, you'd be sentenced to forced labor. The vagrancy laws were particularly vicious. They defined a vagrant as anyone who was idle, unemployed, a beggar, a juggler, someone who practiced unlawful games, a drunkard, a night walker, someone with lewd behavior, or anyone who neglected their job or misspent what they earned. Basically, if you were black and authorities wanted to arrest you, they could find a reason. There were pig laws, too. Stealing something as small as a farm animal or any property worth more than $10 was classified as grand larceny. The punishment? Up to 5 years in prison for stealing a pig. The Mississippi prison population quadrupled almost overnight. Children weren't spared either. Judges could forcibly assign black children to work for their former masters if their parents were deemed unable to support them. It was slavery's apprenticeship system reborn under a different name. And if you were arrested, the arresting officer got paid $5, taken directly from your wages. This created a bounty system. Professional crime hunters roamed the state, arresting black people for minor or fabricated offenses, especially when labor demands increased. The system was designed to fail. Black people who had just been freed from slavery with nothing, no money, no land, no resources, were required to pay special taxes just for being black. If you couldn't pay, you'd be arrested for vagrancy and hired out to whoever would pay your fine. The cycle was inescapable. This led to something called convict leasing, and it was arguably worse than slavery itself. Starting in the late 1860s, Mississippi and other southern states began leasing prisoners to private businesses. Plantation owners, railroad companies, mining operations, lumber yards. Anyone who needed cheap labor could rent prisoners from the state for as little as $9 a month. The state would get paid, the businesses would get free labor, and the prisoners would get nothing. Historian David Oshinsky, who wrote the definitive book on Parchman called Worse Than Slavery, describes what convict leasing looked like. Prisoners worked dangerous jobs that free laborers refused to take. They dynamited tunnels for railroad companies. They cleared malarial swamps for construction. They worked from sunrise to sunset with almost no breaks. They were poorly fed, often sleeping in tents at work sites, chained together. They were whipped and beaten regularly. Medical treatment was almost non-existent. And the mortality rate? Between 9 and 16% of convicts died every single year in the 1880s. For comparison, in states like Ohio during the same period, less than 1% of prisoners died annually. In Mississippi, in 1887 alone, 15% of the state's convicts died. Some years saw mortality rates as high as 40% in particularly brutal operations. One former attorney general described it as producing an epidemic death rate without the epidemic. The thing about convict leasing was this: enslaved people had at least possessed value as property. Slaveholders had a financial incentive to keep them alive. But leased convicts, they cost almost nothing to replace. If one died, another black man would be arrested on a vagrancy charge and sent to take their place. The businesses leasing them had zero incentive to care about their survival. Edward Richardson, a plantation owner who had lost his fortune in the Civil War, became one of the system's greatest beneficiaries. He was the first to sign a convict contract with the state. Officials actually paid him $18,000 a year to house the prisoners, and he kept all the profits from their labor. He regained his entire fortune using prison labor. By 1898, 73% of Alabama's entire state revenue came from convict leasing. In Mississippi, the profits were staggering. The system generated hundreds of thousands of dollars for the state while costing almost nothing to maintain. But by the 1890s, public outrage was growing, not because people cared about the prisoners, though some did, but because poor white laborers began to resent the system. Convict leasing drove wages down. Free workers couldn't compete with businesses using forced labor. Strikes broke out. Labor unions protested. White manufacturers complained they couldn't compete against companies using convict labor. Newspapers began publishing reports about the conditions. Stories of children, some under 10 years old, being leased out and worked to death. Stories of prisoners being whipped until they couldn't stand. Stories of mass graves. In 1890, Mississippi became the first state to officially abolish convict leasing. But they didn't abolish forced prison labor. They just changed who profited from it. Instead of private businesses, the state would now directly control and profit from prisoner labor. And that's how Parchman Farm was born. In 1900, the Mississippi legislature appropriated $80,000 to purchase land in Sunflower County. The land they chose had a history. It was called Parchman Plantation, named after the family that had owned it. It was located in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, some of the richest farmland in the entire United States. This was cotton country, the same land that had been cultivated by enslaved people for generations. In January 1901, the state took possession. They built 4 stockades. Then they transported prisoners to the site and ordered them to clear the land. The land was undeveloped bottomland, dense with forest and undergrowth, but incredibly fertile. The prisoners, using hand tools in their bare hands, cleared thousands of acres. The man who pushed hardest for Parchman was Governor James Kimball Vardaman, elected in 1903. Vardaman was a virulent racist and a populist. He opposed convict leasing not because it was inhumane, but because it benefited big businesses instead of poor white voters. In his 1905 address, Vardaman spoke about what he called the criminal tendency of the Negro and called for vigorous enforcement of vagrancy laws. Vardaman wanted a self-sufficient, profitable prison plantation, and that's exactly what Parchman became. Parchman Farm opened its first full year of operations in 1905. Within 2 years, it had earned $185,000 for the state. That's roughly $5 million in today's money. All of that profit came from one thing: forced labor. The prison sprawled across more than 20,000 acres. Eventually, it would cover 46 square miles. There were no walls, no fences, no guard towers, at least not at first. The prison officials didn't think they needed them. Parchman was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by swamp land and cotton fields. Where would prisoners run? But there was another reason they didn't need walls. The prison had a system that was even more effective: armed prisoners guarding other prisoners. This was called the trustee system, and it was one of the most twisted aspects of Parchman. Prison officials would select certain inmates, often those convicted of the most violent crimes including murder, and give them guns. These men were called trustee shooters or trustees. They were separated from the general population and given special privileges. They wore different uniforms, vertical black and white stripes called up and downs, while regular inmates wore horizontal stripes called ring-arounds. The trustee shooters had one job: keep the other prisoners working, and they were given complete authority to use violence to do it. They carried rifles into the cotton fields. They stood over inmates as they worked. They had the power to whip prisoners who didn't pick enough cotton. They could shoot anyone who tried to run, and they did. Escapees were called rabbits in the row, and trustee shooters were praised for their lethal marksmanship in bringing them down. 2 trustee shooters became infamous: Hogjaw and Kinney. They were real men, not legends. In 1947, Hogjaw was pardoned for killing an inmate trying to escape. That's right, he received a pardon for murder because he killed on behalf of the state. The trustee system was profitable because it was cheap. The state didn't have to hire civilian guards. By law, Mississippi could only employ 150 staff members at Parchman, no matter how many inmates were housed there. So inmates did almost everything. Trustees guarded the other prisoners, managed the barracks, oversaw field work, and enforced discipline. They could recommend additional punishment in what was called the special punishment area. And very few people supervised what the trustee shooters did. For a prison holding nearly 2,000 inmates by the 1970s, there were only about 13 inmates for every staff member. The inmates essentially ran the prison, and the violence was unimaginable. Parchman was organized like a plantation. There were 3 main farms: a small farm maintained by white convicts, a smaller farm worked by women, mostly black, and a massive plantation, over 15,000 acres, worked exclusively by black men. Racial segregation was considered paramount. Black and white inmates never worked together, never lived together, never even appeared in the same photographs. The black men, called gunmen, were woken before dawn. They worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. In the early years, they worked even longer, sometimes 15 hours a day in a 100-degree heat. They picked cotton, chopped cotton, plowed fields with mules, maintained the infrastructure. Everything was done by hand. The work was backbreaking. They lived in long, single-story wooden buildings called cages. These were open barracks with no separation by crime or classification. Murderers slept next to men arrested for vagrancy. The floors were bare. There were no mattresses in the early years. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Raw sewage was dumped in open ditches around the camps. Rats scurried across the floors. The water supply was contaminated. Diseases like dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and malaria spread constantly. Inmates dropped from exhaustion, frostbite, sunstroke, and something called shackle poisoning, which was infections caused by chains and leg irons constantly rubbing against bare flesh. But the worst part was the violence, the systematic, state-sanctioned violence. There was a leather strap used at Parchman. It was 3 feet long and 6 inches wide. It had a name: Black Annie. Inmates were whipped with Black Annie for any infraction. Picking too little cotton, talking back, moving too slowly. Sometimes guards had prisoners whipped just for entertainment. Public whippings were commonplace. They were designed to teach lessons to other inmates. The connection to slavery wasn't subtle. This was the same method slave masters had used on plantations in the same fields decades earlier. Inmates who broke serious rules were sent to the maximum security unit, where things got even worse. In the unit's punishment side, there was a place called the Dark Hole. Prisoners would be locked inside, naked, without clothes, without hygiene materials, without adequate food, sometimes for 48 to 72 hours. Some were handcuffed to fences or bars for extended periods. Others were forced to stand, sit, or lie on crates or stumps in awkward positions for hours. Cattle prods were used to keep prisoners standing or moving. There was no due process. Inmates accused of violating rules had no hearing, no chance to defend themselves. Punishment was swift and brutal, and throughout it all, prisoners had no meaningful way to complain. Their mail was censored. Letters describing conditions were confiscated. If you tried to report abuse, you'd face retaliation. The fields were supervised using something called long lines. Prisoners worked in tight, organized rows, dragging their cotton sacks behind them, moving in rhythm. There were convict callers who led work songs, call and response chants that synchronized the labor and kept morale from completely collapsing. These songs, which became an important part of Delta blues music, were born from suffering. They talked about lost freedom, about hardship, about the endless days under the sun. Musicians like Booker White, who was imprisoned at Parchman in 1937 for shooting a man in self-defense, later recorded these songs. His Parchman Farm Blues, recorded in Chicago in 1940, described the prison's one-arm chair punishments and the endless labor. The song warned young men about the horror of Parchman Farm. The prison was designed to be self-sufficient and profitable, and it was. By 1918, Parchman had a net revenue of $825,000, roughly $800 per inmate. The prison operated a dairy, a slaughterhouse, a cannery, a sawmill, a brickyard, a cotton gin, and manufacturing shops. Women inmates sewed uniforms and bedding for the entire facility. The prison even had its own newspaper, a picture show, and a grocery store. Everything was produced by inmate labor. The bricks used to build the prison, made by inmates. The lumber, cut by inmates. The food, grown and processed by inmates. The clothes, sewn by inmates, and the state kept every cent of profit. In 1911, the New York Times published a sprawling article praising Parchman. The paper called it the pride of Mississippi and claimed that black inmates didn't want to leave when their sentences ended because conditions were supposedly so good. The article said that inmates were given a new suit and $10 upon release, and that they would ask if there was any way they could stay. This was propaganda, pure fiction, but it shaped public perception. The reality was starkly different. Inmates called Parchman hell. They called it worse than slavery because, in many ways, it was. At least enslaved people had some value to their owners. Parchman inmates had none. They could be worked to death, beaten to death, or shot for trying to escape, and the state would simply arrest another black man to take their place. And who were these inmates? About 90% of them were black men. Many were arrested for petty offenses, vagrancy, minor theft, or completely fabricated charges. Some were convicted on the flimsiest evidence or no evidence at all. The justice system in Jim Crow Mississippi wasn't designed to determine guilt or innocence. It was designed to supply bodies for the labor force. Parchman operated this way, largely unchanged, for decades. Some small reforms were introduced. Cotton picking was mechanized in some areas. A parole board was created, though it deferred almost entirely to the prison superintendent. Vocational and educational programs were established, but excluded black prisoners. A gas chamber was built for executions. But the fundamental structure remained a segregated plantation prison where black men were forced to labor under armed guards for the profit of the state. In the 1960s, Parchman briefly became known nationally during the Civil Rights Movement. In the summer of 1961, Freedom Riders, a group of interracial activists protesting segregation, were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. The jails overflowed, so more than 100 activists were sent to Parchman. They were segregated from the general population, but even they experienced the brutality. White Freedom Riders were beaten severely by guards who couldn't understand why they would support black people. Claude Liggins, a black Freedom Rider, later said the guards directed most of their racism toward the white activists, beating some nearly to death. But national attention didn't lead to immediate reform. Parchman remained frozen in time through the 1960s. At the end of the decade, nearly 80% of Parchman guards were still armed inmates. Then, in February 1971, something changed. 4 inmates, Nazareth Gates, Willie Holmes, Matthew Winter, and Hal Zachary, filed a class action lawsuit against the prison. They were represented by a civil rights lawyer named Roy Haber. Haber had visited Parchman and witnessed the conditions firsthand. He later described it as the last legal vestige of slavery. The lawsuit, known as Gates v. Collier, alleged that Parchman's conditions violated the 1st, 8th, 13th, and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. It charged that black inmates were segregated and discriminated against. It detailed the deplorable physical conditions, the lack of medical care, the brutal corporal punishment, the trustee system, and the complete absence of due process. The case went before federal Judge William C. Keedy, and what he found shocked even him. When Judge Keedy inspected Parchman, he described it as an institution in shambles, marked by violence and neglect. The camps were laced with open ditches, holding raw sewage and medical waste. Rats scurried along the floors. Electrical wiring was frayed and exposed. Broken windows were stuffed with rags to keep out the cold. Bathrooms were filthy. Mattresses were rotting. Water supplies were polluted. Kitchens were overrun with insects, rodents, and the stench of decay. The housing units were unfit for human habitation. Judge Keedy heard testimony about physical brutality being regularly inflicted on inmates, about prisoners being handcuffed to fences for days, about the use of cattle prods, about prisoners being denied basic hygiene materials and adequate food, about the trusty shooters, armed convicted murderers, beating and shooting other inmates with impunity. A consultant committee hired by the Mississippi State Planning Agency and the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration concluded that conditions at Parchman were philosophically, psychologically, physically, racially, and morally intolerable. Even the governor of Mississippi conceded. During the proceedings, he admitted that the constitutional provisions have been violated. He asked the judge if there was enough incriminating evidence in the depositions to conclude that the First Amendment and all other constitutional provisions had been violated. The state wasn't even trying to deny it anymore. On October 20, 1972, Judge Keedy issued his ruling. He called Parchman Farm an affront to modern standards of decency. He declared the living conditions unfit for human habitation. He ordered an immediate end to all unconstitutional conditions and practices. The ruling was comprehensive. Judge Keedy ordered the abolition of the trustee system, an end to racial segregation, an end to all forms of corporal punishment, including Black Annie, the establishment of definite rules and regulations for inmate discipline with due process, the improvement of medical facilities, reasonable procedures to protect inmates from assault, renovations to fix health hazards, and an end to the illegal censorship of prisoner mail. The trustee system, which had operated for over 70 years, was finally abolished. Civilian guards were hired to replace armed inmates. Racial segregation was ended, at least officially. Black Annie and other instruments of torture were banned. The ruling was affirmed by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in 1974. Gates v. Collier became a landmark case, the first broad-scale intervention by a court in the supervision of prison practices. It set precedents that forced other southern states, including Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas, to abolish their own trustee systems and reform brutal conditions. But did things really change at Parchman? That's a harder question. Jesmyn Ward, the award-winning author from Mississippi, wrote about Parchman in her novel Sing Unburied Sing. In the book, a character named Richie, the ghost of a boy who died at Parchman decades earlier, returns to the prison and says, "Sometimes I think it done changed, and then I sleep and wake up, and it ain't changed none. It's like a snake that sheds its skin. The outside look different when the scales change, but the inside always the same. Reforms were implemented slowly and unevenly. The state claimed progress. By the 1980s, Parchman mechanized more of its agricultural operations. Farm work became less central to the prison's operations, though inmates still labored in the fields. New facilities were built, programs were expanded, but problems persisted. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice launched a federal investigation into conditions at Parchman and 3 other Mississippi prisons. The investigation examined whether prisoners were adequately protected from violence, whether the prison failed in suicide prevention and mental health care, and whether there was excessive use of solitary confinement. In April 2022, the Justice Department reported that conditions at Parchman were inhumane due to years of neglect by the state. In December 2019, inmates in Unit 29, Parchman's maximum security unit, began posting videos on contraband cell phones. The videos showed fires raging, smoke filling pitch-black corridors, sewage flooding the floors, electrical wires hanging from ceilings. Men screamed that people were being stabbed, that they were dying from lack of medications, that they hadn't eaten or washed in days, that there were no guards or staff present. Posting these videos added years to their sentences, but they were so desperate they did it anyway. Lawsuits followed. In 2020, civil rights organizations filed complaints alleging that Parchman's conditions violated constitutional rights. Experts who visited the prison interviewed inmates and heard story after story of neglect, fear, and inhumanity. They found that guards were often absent. Inmates were denied access to medications for diabetes, mental health conditions, and other serious illnesses. Men who had been stabbed were left to bleed on the floor. In some cases, inmates set their own mattresses on fire just to get someone to come help them. Parchman has had a revolving door of superintendents. Staffing levels remain critically low. The prison still has fewer than half the guards it needs. Some staff members have been caught trafficking contraband into the prison. And here's the thing that never really changed. Parchman's population remains overwhelmingly black. Today, black Mississippians make up 37% of the state's population, but they account for 70% of Parchman's inmates. The same racial disparity that defined the prison in 1901 still defines it today. Parchman's legacy extends beyond its own walls. It represents something much larger, the criminalization of blackness as a means of social control and economic exploitation. The black codes became Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws became the war on drugs and mass incarceration. The faces changed, the rhetoric changed, but the underlying structure remained. Laws are written and enforced in ways that disproportionately impact black communities. Arrests lead to convictions, and convictions lead to forced labor. The 13th Amendment never actually abolished slavery, it just moved it behind bars. And Parchman Farm was the blueprint. For 70 years, from 1901 to the early 1970s, Parchman operated as a slave plantation in everything but name. Thousands of black men were arrested on false or petty charges, sentenced to years of forced labor, worked from sunrise to sunset in cotton fields under armed guards, whipped and beaten and tortured, denied basic human dignity, and sometimes killed. Also, the state of Mississippi could turn a profit. Historian David Oshinsky called Parchman the quintessential penal farm, the closest thing to slavery that survived the Civil War. Federal investigators agreed. In the 1960s, they described Parchman as the closest thing to slavery we've seen. And the truly horrifying part? Parchman wasn't an aberration, it was the model. Louisiana had Angola, Texas had multiple prison farms, Arkansas, Alabama, Georgia Florida. Plantation prisons existed across the South, all following the same blueprint. Use the criminal justice system to arrest black men, use the 13th Amendment's exception clause to justify forced labor, and profit from their suffering. Even today, prisoners across the United States work for pennies an hour or nothing at all. They manufacture goods, fight wildfires, clean highways, and perform services that generate billions of dollars in value, and the majority of these inmates are black and brown. Parchman Farm is a story about how systems of oppression evolve and adapt. Slavery became convict leasing. Convict leasing became Parchman. Parchman became the modern prison industrial complex. The methods change, the language changes, but the exploitation continues. This wasn't ancient history. There are people alive today who survived Parchman when it was still operating as a brutal plantation prison. There are families who lost fathers, brothers, sons to Parchman's violence. The scars are still fresh. And Parchman is still there, still operating, still holding over 3,000 inmates, still plagued by violence and neglect. The fields where men once picked cotton under the threat of whipping and gunfire are still there. The land where thousands suffered is still there. The question isn't just what happened at Parchman. The question is, why did it take 70 years to stop it? And why, even after Gates versus Collier, do the problems persist? Why does the system keep reproducing itself? Because Parchman wasn't designed to rehabilitate. It was designed to profit. It was designed to control. It was designed to continue what slavery started. And until we confront that truth, until we acknowledge that the criminal justice system in America has its roots in slavery and racial oppression, the cycle will continue. The snake will shed its skin, but the inside will stay the same. Parchman Farm is a monument to one of America's darkest chapters. It's a place where the promise of freedom after the Civil War was broken, where the 13th Amendment's loophole was exploited to the fullest, and where thousands of black lives were destroyed in the pursuit of profit. It's a story that should never be forgotten, because the only way to prevent history from repeating is to remember what happened, to name it for what it was, and to demand that it never happens again. Parchman Farm was hell, and for decades the state of Mississippi called it justice. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.